The scorching Arizona sun cast harsh shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch as townspeople gathered for what would become the most shameful spectacle the territory had witnessed in the summer of 1885. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stood on the wooden platform outside the jailhouse, his cruel smile gleaming as he yanked the chains binding a young woman's wrists. Her name was Elena Vasquez, though few in the crowd knew or cared about her identity. All they saw was a broken figure in a torn calico dress, her dark hair matted with dust, her olive skin marked with bruises that told a story of injustice no one wanted to hear. The crowd pressed closer, miners and drifters and decent folk alike drawn by the promise of cheap entertainment. Children pointed and laughed while their mothers pretended to look away. The saloon girls watched from their windows above, some with pity in their painted faces, others with the cold calculation of those who understood survival meant sometimes watching others fall. Sheriff Briggs raised his voice above the murmur of the gathering. His words cut through the desert air like a whip crack. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a thief here. Caught red-handed stealing from Banker Morrison's safe. The law says she owes the town for her crimes." He jerked the chain, forcing Elena to stumble forward. "Sell her for $1, that's all she's worth. Work off her debt in whatever manner the buyer sees fit." The crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Someone threw a coin that bounced off Elena's shoulder. Another voice called out suggestions that made decent women cover their children's ears. Elena kept her chin raised despite everything, her dark eyes blazing with a defiance that refused to be broken, even as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. But at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the hitching post outside Murphy's General Store, stood a man who wasn't laughing. Samuel Cross was 35 years old, though the desert sun and 3 years of grief had aged him beyond his years. His weathered face remained impassive as he watched the spectacle, his calloused hands resting on the brim of the worn Stetson he held at his side. The townspeople knew him as a man of few words and fewer friends, a rancher who'd lost his wife and infant son to fever, and had spoken barely 100 words to anyone since the funeral. Samuel's pale blue eyes studied Elena's face, seeing past the dirt and bruises to something that made his chest tighten with recognition. It wasn't her beauty, though she was beautiful in the way desert wildflowers were beautiful, fragile yet resilient. It was the look in her eyes, the same look his Mary had worn when she'd fought the fever that eventually claimed her, a refusal to surrender even when everything seemed lost. The bidding began in earnest now. A burly miner waved a silver dollar. "I'll take her for cleaning and such," he leered, and the implications in his voice made several women in the crowd shift uncomfortably. The blacksmith countered with $2. "Could use help around the forge," he called out, though everyone knew what kind of help he meant. Sheriff Briggs was enjoying himself immensely. This wasn't just about Elena's supposed crime, though she'd never stolen so much as a biscuit from anyone. This was about power, about showing the town what happened to those who crossed him. Elena's father had owned a small but valuable piece of land with a natural spring, land that Briggs coveted for his own purposes. When Diego Vasquez had refused to sell, accidents started happening. His crops failed. His cattle died. And then Diego himself had met with an unfortunate end, trampled by his own horse, or so the sheriff claimed. Elena had been alone then, 19 years old with no family and no protection. She'd tried to maintain the farm, but mysterious fires and further accidents made it impossible. When she'd finally confronted Briggs about his obvious involvement, he'd fabricated the theft charges. Now here she stood, about to be sold like livestock to pay for crimes she'd never committed. If you're enjoying this tale of redemption and justice in the Old West, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell because this story is just getting started, and what happens next will shock you to your core. The bidding reached $5 when Samuel finally moved. He walked through the crowd with measured steps, his spurs jingling softly against the boardwalk. People parted for him automatically, some nodding respectfully, others eyeing him with curiosity. Samuel Cross was known as an honest man, one of the few in Redemption Gulch who couldn't be bought or intimidated. His ranch was modest but successful, his cattle healthy, his word his bond. Sheriff Briggs noticed him approaching, and his smile widened. "Well now, Sam Cross. Didn't expect to see you at a social gathering." You looking to bid on our little criminal here? Samuel stopped at the base of the platform, close enough that Elena could see the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the way his jaw was set with quiet determination. For a moment, their gazes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. "Sell her for $1, Briggs repeated, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "That's all she's worth, according to the law. Course, you might get more use out of her than most. What with that big, empty ranch of yours?" The crowd laughed again, but there was an edge to it now, a discomfort that came from watching a good man being mocked. Samuel had never bothered anyone, had helped neighbors during hard times, had buried his grief in honest work. Even those who barely knew him respected his integrity. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather pouch. The crowd fell silent as he untied the strings and poured the contents into his palm. Gold dust caught the afternoon sunlight, more wealth than most of these people had ever seen in one place. Without a word, he tossed the pouch at Sheriff Briggs' feet, where it landed with a solid thud that scattered dust and dreams. The silence stretched like a held breath. Someone whispered a prayer. A child asked his mother what was happening. Sheriff Briggs stared at the gold, his face cycling through surprise, greed, and finally rage. "Gold," Briggs sputtered, his voice rising to a near shriek. "For her? You're a fool, Cross. That's enough to buy half the county, and you want to waste it on this thieving Mexican." Samuel stepped onto the platform, moving with the calm confidence of a man who'd made his decision and would see it through regardless of consequences. The boards creaked under his boots as he approached Elena, who watched him with a mixture of hope and terror. "Not her," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. "My wife." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Women gasped. Men removed their hats. Even the children sensed something momentous was happening. Samuel Cross, the hermit rancher who'd spoken to no one about anything more significant than cattle prices in 3 years, had just claimed a stranger as his wife in front of the entire town. But friends, that was just the beginning of this incredible story, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're loving this tale of courage and redemption. Sheriff Briggs' face turned purple with rage. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Elena was supposed to be humiliated, broken, sold to the highest bidder for whatever degrading purposes they chose. Instead, she was being claimed by one of the most respected men in the territory, elevated from prisoner to wife in the span of a heartbeat. "Now wait just a minute," Briggs growled, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "This woman is a criminal. She belongs to the territory until her debt is paid." Samuel's own hand didn't move toward his weapon, but something in his stance, in the set of his shoulders, made it clear he was ready for whatever came next. "I paid her debt," he said simply. "That pouch contains more gold than this town sees in a year. More than enough to cover whatever she supposedly owes." Deputy Williams, a nervous young man who secretly despised his boss but needed the job, cleared his throat. "Sheriff, that's a lot of gold. More than fair compensation for any theft, if there was a theft." Briggs whirled on his deputy. "Whose side are you on, Williams?" "The side of the law," Williams replied quietly, and several townspeople nodded approvingly. Samuel stepped closer to Elena, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to frighten her. She watched him approach, this stranger who'd just changed the course of her life with a pouch of gold and 5 simple words. He was tall and lean from hard work, his brown hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face was weathered but kind, marked by grief but not hardened by it. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "If you'll allow me." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Samuel reached for the chains that bound her wrists, his fingers gentle as he worked the crude locks. The metal fell away with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the silent street. Elena rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed, hardly believing she was free. The crowd began to murmur, a low susurrus of voices debating what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife, dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. About time someone stood up to that bully, she whispered to her husband, who nodded grimly. Old Pete, who ran the livery stable, spat in the dust. Known Sam Cross for 10 years. If he says she's his wife, then she's his wife, and that's good enough for me. But Sheriff Briggs wasn't finished. His hand now rested openly on his gun butt, his face twisted with fury. This ain't over, Cross. You can't just waltz in here and... Can't what? The voice came from the back of the crowd, and people turned to see Mayor Hutchins pushing through the throng. He was a small, fussy man who usually stayed out of Sheriff Briggs' way, but today something had changed. Can't pay a lawful debt? Can't claim a wife? Seems to me Sam's done nothing but follow the letter of the law. More voices joined in, emboldened by the mayor's support. That's right. Man paid fair and square. More than fair. Sheriffs had this coming. Samuel helped Elena down from the platform, his hand steady under her elbow. She leaned on him more than she meant to, her legs shaky from the ordeal and the sudden reversal of fortune. He smelled of leather and sage and honest sweat, comforting scents that spoke of safety and stability. My horse is just over there, he said quietly, nodding toward a sturdy bay gelding tied at the rail. Can you walk that far? Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As they moved through the crowd, people stepped aside respectfully. Some of the women reached out to touch her hand or shoulder, offering silent support. The men tipped their hats to Samuel, acknowledging what he'd done. But Sheriff Briggs wasn't about to let his prize slip away so easily. Stop right there, he bellowed, drawing his gun. That woman is wanted for theft. I don't care how much gold you threw around, Cross. She's coming back to jail until this is sorted out proper. The crowd fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Before, it had been the silence of people watching entertainment. Now it was the silence of people choosing sides. Samuel turned slowly, his hand still supporting Elena's elbow. His pale eyes fixed on Sheriff Briggs with an intensity that made several people step back. Sheriff, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. I've lived in this territory for 8 years. In that time, I've never broken a law, never cheated a man, never failed to pay a debt. My word is my bond, and my bond is backed by my life. He paused, letting that sink in. I've claimed this woman as my wife, and I've paid her debt with legal tender. If you have a problem with that, we can settle it right here, right now. This is where things get really intense, folks. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss how this showdown plays out. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Sheriff Briggs stood with his gun half drawn, sweat beading on his forehead despite the desert heat. Samuel faced him calmly, unarmed but unafraid. Between them stood Elena, the prize they were fighting over, though she was no longer just a prize. Samuel's declaration had transformed her from victim to victor, from chattel to chosen. Deputy Williams cleared his throat nervously. Sheriff, maybe we should think about this. That's a lot of gold, and Sam Cross has never caused trouble before. Shut up, Williams, Briggs snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He was beginning to realize that public opinion had shifted against him, and that shooting an unarmed man in front of half the town might not be the wisest course of action. Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. Sheriff Briggs, as the elected mayor of this town, I'm ordering you to holster your weapon. Mr. Cross has broken no law. He's interfering with official business. What official business? Mrs. Henderson spoke up from the crowd. Selling a woman like she was livestock? That's not law, that's barbarism. Other voices joined hers. She's right. This ain't right. Sheriff's gone too far this time. About time someone stood up to him. Samuel sensed the mood shifting and pressed his advantage. Sheriff, you want to draw iron on me, that's your choice. But ask yourself this, is your pride worth dying for? Because I promise you, if you pull that gun, one of us won't be walking away from this street. The threat was delivered quietly, without bluster or bravado, which made it all the more convincing. Samuel Cross had the reputation of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. Sheriff Briggs looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing condemnation where once there had been fear and compliance. His authority was slipping away like sand through his fingers, and he knew it. Slowly, reluctantly, he eased his gun back into its holster. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Samuel nodded once, acknowledging the threat without fear. Then he turned back to Elena, offering her his arm. "Shall we go home, Mrs. Cross?" The formal address sent a ripple through the crowd. By using her new name, Samuel was making their union real in the eyes of the community, binding them together with words as surely as any preacher could with ceremony. Elena looked up at him, this stranger who'd become her salvation, and found her voice at last. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all her gratitude and hope. "Let's go home." They walked to his horse together, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. Samuel untied the reins and helped Elena into the saddle, his hands respectful and careful. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, protective without being possessive. As they rode out of town, the crowd began to disperse, but the talk would continue for hours, days, years to come. The day Samuel Cross faced down Sheriff Briggs and claimed a wife would become legend, told and retold around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. But right now, as the horse carried them away from Redemption Gulch and toward the rolling hills where Samuel's ranch waited, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The man behind her was a stranger, but he'd risked everything to save her. She didn't know what the future held, but it had to be better than the fate she'd just escaped. The ride to Samuel's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country in the Arizona territory. Rolling hills covered with sage and creosote gave way to green valleys where cattle grazed peacefully. The ranch house sat in one such valley, a modest but well-built structure of adobe and timber, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. As they approached, Elena could see the care Samuel had put into his home. The fences were straight and strong, the barn well-maintained, the house itself neat and welcoming despite its simplicity. Flowers grew in boxes beneath the windows, and a vegetable garden showed signs of recent tending. Samuel helped her down from the horse, his touch still gentle and respectful. "It's not much," he said, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left town. "But it's peaceful. Safe." Elena looked around at the valley, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the endless sky above. After months of fear and uncertainty, the simple promise of safety was more precious than gold. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Samuel nodded toward the house. "You'll want to rest, I expect. Clean up, maybe eat something. There's a room." He paused, suddenly awkward. "There's a room you can use. No pressure, no expectations. Just shelter until you decide what you want to do." The kindness in his voice brought tears to Elena's eyes. She'd almost forgotten that such kindness existed in the world. Inside, the house was clean and comfortable, furnished with handmade pieces that showed Samuel's skill with wood and leather. But Elena noticed something else. Photographs on the mantelpiece, a woman's shawl still draped over a chair, a child's wooden toy horse sitting on a shelf. This was a house that had known love and loss, a home that still mourned its missing family. Samuel noticed her looking at the photographs. "My wife Mary," he said quietly. "And our son Thomas. Fever took them both 3 years ago." Elena picked up the photograph, studying the face of the woman who'd been loved by this good man. Mary Cross had been beautiful in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The baby in her arms gazed at the camera with the solemn wonder of the very young. "I'm sorry," Elena said, setting the photograph down carefully. "They look like they were very happy." "They were," Samuel agreed. "We all were, for a time." He showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house, simply furnished but comfortable. A quilt covered the bed, and clean towels waited on the washstand. A window looked out over the garden and the hills beyond. "Rest as long as you need," Samuel said. "I'll be outside if you need anything." After he left, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great, shuddering sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her very soul. She cried for her father, murdered for his land. She cried for her lost innocence, for the months of fear and degradation. She cried for the woman she'd been before Sheriff Briggs had destroyed her life, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. But underneath the grief and fear was something else: gratitude. This stranger, this Samuel Cross, had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to lift her up. He'd risked his safety, his standing in the community, his very life to save her. She didn't understand why, couldn't fathom what had motivated such an act of pure selflessness, but she was grateful beyond words. Later, after she'd washed and changed into clean clothes that Samuel had somehow provided, Elena found him in the garden behind the house. He was tending to the vegetables, his movements careful and practiced. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "Mr. Cross," she began, then stopped. "What did you say to a man who'd just saved your life?" He looked up from the tomato plants he was staking. "Samuel," he corrected gently. "Or Sam, if you prefer. We're married in the eyes of the law now, even if it's not." He trailed off, his face reddening slightly. "Even if it's not real," Elena finished for him. Samuel straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's as real as you want it to be," he said carefully. "I know the circumstances weren't exactly traditional, but the declaration was made in front of witnesses. If you choose to honor it, then it's real. If you don't," he shrugged, "then it's just words that bought your freedom." Elena studied his face in the fading light. There was no pressure there, no expectation or demand. Just an honest offer from an honest man. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her heart since he'd thrown that pouch of gold at Sheriff Briggs' feet. "Why did you risk everything for a stranger?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "When Mary was dying," he said, "she made me promise something. She said life was too short to stand by and watch injustice happen. She said if I ever saw someone who needed help, really needed it, I should help them, no matter the cost." He looked at Elena then, his pale eyes serious. "I've never seen anyone need help more than you did today." The simple honesty of his answer took Elena's breath away. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just a promise made to a dying wife and kept by a man who understood the meaning of honor. This is the kind of story that restores your faith in humanity, friends. If you're moved by Samuel's incredible act of courage, make sure to leave a comment below telling us what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales from the Old West. That night, as Elena lay in the comfortable bed in Samuel's guest room, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she'd awakened in a jail cell, facing a future of degradation and despair. Tonight she was sleeping in a clean bed in a safe house, protected by a man who asked nothing in return for his kindness. She could hear Samuel moving around in the main room, banking the fire and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting, domestic, normal in a way her life hadn't been for months. For the first time since her father's death, Elena felt truly safe. But safety was just the beginning. Over the next few days, as Elena settled into life at the ranch, she began to understand the kind of man who'd rescued her. Samuel rose before dawn to tend his cattle, worked through the heat of the day with quiet determination, and spent his evenings reading or working on small projects around the house. He was unfailingly polite to Elena, treating her with a respect she'd almost forgotten existed, but he maintained a careful distance that spoke of his own deep wounds. The house still bore the traces of his lost family. Mary's clothes still hung in the bedroom he no longer used, preferring to sleep in the small room off the kitchen. Thomas's toys remained where they'd been left, as if Samuel expected his son to return at any moment to claim them. It was a shrine to grief, beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Elena found herself taking over the household duties gradually, not because Samuel asked or expected it, but because she needed something to do, some way to contribute to the sanctuary he'd provided. She cooked meals that Samuel ate with quiet appreciation, mended clothes that had long needed attention, and tended the garden with skills learned at her father's side. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, speaking little but finding comfort in each other's presence. Elena began to understand that Samuel was as damaged as she was, just in different ways. Where she carried the wounds of betrayal and injustice, he bore the deeper scars of love lost and a future stolen. A week after her rescue, Elena was hanging laundry on the line when she saw riders approaching from the direction of town. Her heart leaped with fear until she recognized Mayor Hutchins' small figure among them. Samuel emerged from the barn, having seen them as well, and walked to meet them with Elena at his side. "Sam," Mayor Hutchins called out as he dismounted. "Wanted to come out and see how you folks were settling in." With him were Deputy Williams, old Pete from the livery, and surprisingly, Mrs. Henderson and 2 other women from town. They dismounted and approached with the awkward courtesy of people who weren't sure of their welcome. "Mayor," Samuel nodded. "Deputy, what brings you out this way?" Deputy Williams cleared his throat nervously. "Well, Sam, there've been some developments in town. About Sheriff Briggs and other matters." "What kind of developments?" "The kind where a man's past catches up with him," Mayor Hutchins said grimly. "Seems some folks from over in Tucson have been asking questions about our sheriff. Questions about missing persons and unexplained deaths." Elena felt Samuel tense beside her. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest our Sheriff Briggs might not be who he claims to be," Deputy Williams said. "Real name might be Clayton Burke, wanted for murder in 3 territories." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her expression sympathetic as she looked at Elena. "Dear, we also wanted you to know that we've been asking around about your father's death. Some folks are starting to remember things differently than they did when the sheriff was asking the questions." Elena's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean there were witnesses to what really happened to Diego Vasquez," old Pete said bluntly. "Witnesses who were too scared to speak up before, but who might be willing to talk now that Briggs' authority is in question." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. If they could prove that Sheriff Briggs had murdered her father, if they could expose his other crimes, then her own charges would be revealed as the fabrications they'd always been. She could have her name cleared, her father's death avenged, her life restored. But as the visitors continued talking, Elena found herself looking at Samuel, watching his face as he processed this information. He was pleased for her, she could see that, but there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like loss. Later, after the visitors had left with promises to keep them informed of any developments, Elena confronted Samuel about what she'd seen. "You're not happy about this news," she said as they stood in the garden where they'd first really talked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hands busy with meaningless tasks among the plants. "I'm happy for you," he said finally. "You deserve to have your name cleared, your father's death investigated properly." "But," he sighed, straightening to look at her directly, "but if Briggs is arrested, if your charges are dropped, then you won't need to stay here anymore. You'll be free to go wherever you want, do whatever you choose with your life." Elena stared at him, understanding flooding through her. "And you think I'll leave? Why wouldn't you?" Samuel's voice was carefully neutral. "You're young, beautiful, intelligent. You could go anywhere, marry anyone. Why would you want to stay here with a grief-stricken widower who's old enough to be your father?" "You're 35, Elena said softly. "Hardly old enough to be my father." "Sometimes I feel ancient," Samuel admitted. "Especially since Mary and Thomas died. Most days I feel like I died with them and just forgot to lie down." Elena stepped closer to him, close enough to see the pain that lived behind his pale eyes, the loneliness that had carved lines around his mouth. "Is that what you thought when you saw me on that platform?" she asked. "That I was just another lost soul who needed saving?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "Maybe at first," he said honestly. "But not now. Now I think maybe we saved each other." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and hope. Elena reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against Samuel's weathered hand. "Samuel," she said quietly, "what if I don't want to leave?" He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "What if you do, once you've had time to think about it? Once you're really free to choose?" "Then I'll go," Elena said simply. "But not because I have to. Because I choose to. And right now today, I choose to stay." Samuel's eyes met hers, searching for doubt or obligation or pity. He found none of those things. Instead, he saw something that made his breath catch. The same look Mary used to get when she was absolutely certain about something, a certainty that brooked no argument or doubt. "Elena," he whispered, her name like a prayer on his lips. "Yes. Would it be all right if I kissed you?" In answer, Elena rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings, of two wounded souls finding healing in each other's arms. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Samuel rested his forehead against Elena's, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "I love you," he said, the words coming from some deep place he'd thought closed forever. "I didn't think I could love anyone again, but I love you." "I love you too," Elena whispered back. "I think I have since the moment you called me your wife." They were married again 3 weeks later, properly this time, by Reverend Martinez in the little church in town. The whole community turned out for the celebration, including several territorial marshals who'd come to arrest the man they now knew was Clayton Burke, not Clayton Briggs. The false sheriff was in custody, facing charges in multiple territories, and Elena's name had been completely cleared. But that wasn't the end of the story, friends. Oh no, the best part was yet to come. The wedding was everything Elena had dreamed of as a girl and everything Samuel had forgotten he wanted. Elena wore Mary's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, with Mary's blessing given through Samuel's memory of his first wife's generous heart. Samuel wore his best suit and a smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and happier than he had in years. Mayor Hutchins performed the civil ceremony since Reverend Martinez handled the religious portions, and Deputy Williams, now the acting sheriff until a proper election could be held, served as one of the witnesses. Mrs. Henderson cried through the entire service, and even old Pete was seen wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. But the most moving moment came when Samuel slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, the same ring that had belonged to his mother and his grandmother before her. As he spoke the traditional vows, his voice broke slightly on the words, "Till death do us part," remembering another woman who'd worn this ring, another promise that had been cut short by fate. Elena understood, and when it came time for her vows, she added words of her own. "I promise to love you," she said, her voice clear and strong, "not to replace what you've lost, but to build something new with what we've found." The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by every family in town and music provided by a fiddle player who'd ridden in from the next county. Samuel and Elena danced their first dance as husband and wife to a slow, sweet melody that spoke of lasting love and second chances. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Samuel and Elena found themselves standing outside under the stars, holding hands and marveling at how much their lives had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked quietly. "Taking such a risk for a stranger?" Samuel turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face in the starlight. "Never," he said firmly. "Not once, not for a second. You're the best thing that's happened to me since." He paused, then continued honestly, "Since ever, really. What Mary and I had was beautiful, but it was young love, untested by real hardship. What we have is different, deeper, built on choice rather than just feeling." Elena smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "I used to think my life was over when Papa died, when Briggs destroyed everything I cared about. I thought I'd never be happy again, never feel safe again. And now I think maybe everything that happened was meant to happen, to bring us together." "Is that foolish?" Samuel shook his head. "Not foolish at all. I used to think God had abandoned me when he took Mary and Thomas. Now I think maybe he was just preparing me for you." They kissed again under the desert stars, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the promise of tomorrow. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs to the moon, and somewhere in the darkness, new life was stirring, waiting to be born. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same garden where she and Samuel had first talked about love and choice, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. Samuel was beside her, his arm around her waist, both of them watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you think they'd approve?" Elena asked, nodding toward the photographs that still graced the mantelpiece inside, though they'd been joined now by new pictures of Samuel and Elena, of their wedding day, of the life they were building together. Samuel considered the question seriously. "I think Mary would be happy that I found love again," he said finally. "She always worried about me being alone. And I think she'd love you for making me remember how to smile." "And Thomas. Thomas would be excited about having a little brother or sister to teach things to," Samuel said with certainty. "He always wanted siblings." Elena leaned back against Samuel's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the strength of his arms around her. "I wish I could have known them." "You do know them," Samuel said softly. "They're part of me, part of what made me the man who was able to love you. Without them, without that loss, I might not have recognized what I was seeing when I watched you on that platform. I might not have understood how precious life is, how important it is to fight for what matters." As if summoned by their conversation, a gentle breeze stirred the garden, carrying the scent of desert flowers and the promise of rain. Elena felt the baby move inside her, a small flutter of life that made her smile. "I love you, Samuel Cross," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "I love you too, Elena Cross," he replied, and kissed her as the last light faded from the sky. And that, friends, is how a single act of courage and compassion changed 2 lives forever. How a man who'd lost everything found the strength to save a stranger, and how that stranger became his salvation in return. It's a reminder that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to care about someone else's pain. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that there's still good in this world, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist, that love can conquer hate, and that every ending can be a new beginning. And remember, the best stories are the ones we live ourselves, the moments when we choose compassion over cruelty, love over fear, hope over despair. You have the power to be someone's Samuel Cross, to step forward when others step back, to choose kindness when the world offers only indifference. The desert sun sets on our tail, but somewhere out there, new stories are beginning, new lives are being changed by simple acts of courage and love. Be part of those stories. Choose to be the hero in someone else's darkest hour. Because in the end, that's what love really is, the willingness to risk everything for someone else's happiness, to see worth in another person when the whole world has written them off, to say with your actions if not your words, "You matter, you're valuable, you're worth saving." That's the legacy of Samuel and Elena Cross, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when hope seems lost, love finds a way to triumph, justice finds a way to prevail, and broken hearts find a way to heal. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Old West, where legends were born and love conquered all. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because the greatest stories are the ones that bring us together, that remind us of our shared humanity, and that inspire us to be better than we were yesterday. Until next time, remember that every sunset promises a new dawn, every ending holds the seeds of a new beginning, and somewhere out there, someone is waiting for their own Samuel Cross to step out of the crowd and change their life forever.